This is the big problem, isn't it? I mean, in order to get the economy, going for years to come, what you have to do is get young people on the property ladder. It seems increasingly difficult.
Well, I'm not so sure. House prices, yes, seem to be going up relentlessly. And, despite everything that's been thrown at the housing market over the last few years, we've had Brexits and threats of no-deal Brexit, and of course now the pandemic, lockdown and so on. House prices now are about £50,000 higher than they were at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020. But where first-time buyers are concerned, actually what the numbers show is that last year there are, almost for the first time, about 400,000 first-time buyers entered the UK property market. So about 25% of all properties that were sold were to first-time buyers. So I think, we can kind of feel sorry for first-time buyers that, because house prices are going up, therefore it must be more difficult for them. But they do seem to still be managing, frankly, Stephen, and that's what the numbers show. And I guess the reasons behind that are that they have significant help that the likes of perhaps, you and I and Anne didn't have a few years ago when we were trying to buy our first homes. So things like no stamp duty. So first-time buyers under £300,000 now don't pay any stamp duty at all. The fact that we have this thing called the Bank of Mum and Dad, of course, which is this fictitious bank, which if it were a bank would actually be one of the top 10 banks, which lends billions and billions of pounds to kids and grandchildren for the purposes of helping them with deposits. So, and of course, look, still, despite the fact that interest rates keep going up, we saw another interest rate rise this week, which no doubt will be passed on to mortgage holders. Interest rates relatively are still very, very, very low indeed. You can still bag a mortgage as a first-time buyer as a fixed rate for less than 3%. So I don't want to sound insensitive, but I don't lament quite so much for first-time buyers as perhaps other people do.
Well, you ought to come to my house then, because I've got 4 sons who are all lamenting it, and half the newsroom back there are saying the same thing. It's one thing to be able to afford a mortgage, but it's quite another to actually try and afford the deposit to get on that ladder in the first place. Don't you see that?
Well, I do, but the deposits these days, so you can obtain a mortgage with a 5% deposit, so a 95% loan-to-value mortgage. So, I think we've all had to gather a deposit together. I did when I bought my first property in the late 80s. I had to get a deposit together. So, if the average house price is £286,000, 5% of that is £14,000. I don't think that's a huge obstacle.
Wow.
Well, you have to tell my sons that. Well, I'll go home and tell my sons that, but they moan about the fact that you can't get a decent mortgage without a deposit of 50 or 60 grand.
No, but that just simply isn't true. So, of course, the higher the deposit, the lower the loan to value, the better the rate. But there are hundreds of mortgage products out there right now where for a 5 or perhaps a 10% deposit, you can get a mortgage at a rate that certainly could not ever have been 80s or 90s. I mean, that's simply a fact. So I think there's a lot of media attention to the plight of first-time buyers. But I go back to the data, Anne. If 25% of all buyers in the UK property market are first-time buyers, so 400,000 people in 2021, it's certainly not impossible to get on the first rung of the property ladder as a first-time buyer, is it?
It'd be interesting to see the statistics on that, though. In how old are first-time buyers? I wonder if the age has slipped from sort of mid-20s to mid to late 30s.
Yeah. Look, it's the average the first-time buyer now is about 34 years old. So of course, no, look, they're not spring chickens for sure. So the reason for that is that they've had to have a career, save money, and so on. So yes, the average first-time buyer has definitely got older. But we remain an aspirational home-owning nation. People still want to buy property, whereas in other markets like Germany, people seem very happy to rent. And I think we should be pretty proud of that. And then, of course, if we turn the whole argument round, we've got the fact that if the average property is making about £30,000 a year in profit, that equity does all sorts of wonderful things where consumer spending and the wider economy is concerned. And the fact that houses are now earning more than people, so it takes some getting your head around that. The fact that the average house price is going up more than the average wage is of about £30,000. Now, the question, I guess, is that sustainable? And all of these price increases that we've seen over recent months, double-digit annual increases, is it sustainable? And actually, my answer would have to be no. We've seen in recent kind of house price booms that often bust follows boom. Now, I don't think we're going to see that here. But I do think these continual interest rate rises, which obviously are being introduced by the Bank of England to temper inflation, they are definitely going to have an effect on the rate of growth. So I suspect by the end of this year, house price growth will have dropped from where it is now, which is just over 10%, probably to around 4 or 5%. So I think that's probably the outcome. But do I foresee a crash at the end of all this? No, absolutely not. There's simply too much demand. Money's too cheap still. And above all, there's a real lack of stock. Estate agents have probably got around 30 properties in their drawer per branch. And it was up in the 45s and 50s 2 or 3 years ago. So there's a real lack of stock, which is also driving prices up.
There is another question as well. It's not whether it's sustainable, this sort of growth, it's whether it's moral. Because if you just said their houses are making more money than people, does that seem right to you?
Yeah. Well, I'll throw it back at you, Ed. Is capitalism moral? Because that's what this is. This is house market capitalism. And we're a capitalistic society, a free market, which I think, again, we should be really proud of. We can reverse it all, of course, with, state intervention and so on. But I think that's a hideous, slippery slope that certainly I wouldn't be voting for in the next election.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.